Thank you for coming back after lunch. I'm afraid you're going to hear too much from me, but I like to talk. So this is the same as before. So this lecture is more about, this maybe should have been the first lecture. This is really about an introduction to protein purification, something about proteins and what are the forces that hold them together and hold them to chromatography resins and things. And then how do you keep your proteins active and stable while you're working with them. Again, I'll recommend this book on methods in enzymology. If you want to read papers about protein purification, this journal of ours is devoted to it. Many journals won't let you publish the details of a purification, and so you can't possibly reproduce it. But our journal is really very much wants to be able to publish the details so that people can follow them and reproduce them. Again, I'm happy to talk to people who are doing protein purification and want to consider submitting to our journal to give you some clues about what I think makes a good paper. But I don't want to do it right now. Okay, so the object of purification is usually to isolate a protein out of a mixture. This I have to say is before proteomic thinking. So now people want to study everything in the cell under every condition as a function of the days of the week. But in E. coli we have on the order of 4,000 proteins, and most mammalian cells on the order of 20,000. Plus there are many isoforms in higher organisms. They can vary from being just trace amounts to being very large proportion of the total protein. Rubisco in plants is a very abundant protein, one of the most abundant proteins in the world. But there's other things other than other proteins. There's nucleic acids, there's carbohydrates, there's lipids, there's all of the metabolites. And we don't actually usually think about that when we actually purify a protein, or whether we've gotten rid of all the lipids, for example. I certainly don't do any assays for lipids. But I'm mainly interested in getting rid of other proteins, and they're found in many locations. So this gives you a feel for it. This is a two-dimensional gel, very popular 10 years ago or more. It's done less now because it's very difficult to do well. But you separate a protein mix, in this case E. coli extract, by isoelectric focusing, which is a method that separates on the basis of isoelectric point. At what pH do I have zero net charge? And so you can see proteins vary from being very acidic proteins with isoelectric points around 4.5, out to ones that are very basic proteins that have isoelectric points as high as 10. Then you take a gel that has the protein separated that way, and then you layer it on the top of a slab gel, SDS gel, and you separate on the basis of size from about 160,000 up here to around 10,000 down here. So this gives you a sort of a spreading out of the proteins. These buttons I have big thumbs. So these proteins, by the way, are ribosomal proteins. They're very abundant, they're very small, and they're very basic. That's why you see a bunch here. This protein up here is the beta prime subunit of RNA polymerase, which is what I did my PhD thesis on. It's essentially the largest protein in E. coli. But suppose your professor says to you, I want you to purify that protein. Well, you've got to find some way of separating, fractionating proteins so that you get that protein away from all the other proteins. If you did it something based on isoelectric point, there would be lots of proteins that would be around, whatever that is, 5.5, 5.6 isoelectric point. if you did a sizing in SDS, you would see there's quite a few proteins that have a molecular weight around 40. So you can't just do sizing and isoelectric focusing and expect to get it. Because first of all, your protein might not even be a monomer, it might be a dimer, in which case it's not 40, it's 80, and and so on. So the protein purification is really using ways of fractionating proteins in order to separate out one from all the rest, or a cluster, because as you know, many proteins now really act as complexes. But people didn't know that when I started graduate school in 1964. Nobody knew about protein complexes. Okay, again, the course that I teach, and what I think about most is in this sort of scale where you're trying to isolate milligrams. But pilot plants and industrial things can go much, much higher. And Gui is more of an expert on that, and others are experts on larger scale. But I'm finding that I'm interested in mostly in this area. What used to be, I was interested in this area, but I think, maybe I said this earlier, what used to be analytical has now become preparative. I mean, you only need 10 milligrams of protein to do almost everything that you want to do, even get crystals. So certainly I was talking to Pia, and nanograms to micrograms is enough to do a lot of mass spec with. So you don't really need a lot of protein in order to do many of the things that you want to do. It used to be it took a lot of protein to do what you wanted to do. Anyway, it varies. And also the purity that you need to reach. If you're trying to isolate proteins to make antibodies, you would need to have, I'd say, a milligram quantity. But if you're doing polyclonals where you inject a rabbit or a goat, you need quite high purity protein, because it turns out that the animal always makes the best antibodies against the impurities. And so you really have to have a pretty pure protein if you want to get most of your antibody against the protein of interest. With monoclonals, you can actually immunize with a less pure sample, because you're going to be selecting for the antibody the hybridoma cell lines that produce an antibody against your protein. And so once you have that, it doesn't matter what other monoclonals were there. But for enzymology and many of these things, you need reasonably high purity. For research enzymes, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, where Promega lives. And when Promega started in 1975, they made restriction enzymes. They were really impure. All they had to be is free of other nucleases. They didn't have to be pure. They just had to be, and especially exonucleases that would chew in from ends. So later on, one of my students went to work with them and got them making much purer materials. But at the beginning, all it required was that you had something that had the activity that was wanted and didn't have the activity that would interfere with your experiment. Pharmaceuticals, on the other hand, are ridiculous. I mean, 99.99%. I mean, the amount of host cell protein that is in your sample has got to be very low, a few parts per billion. And none of us, as a biochemist, purify things to that level. I mean, even Hugo only got 99.1%. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. You have to sort of over-purify 2 or 3 times in order to get it there. It's actually ridiculous. When you get a sliver, a little piece of wood stuck into your finger, you get much more protein than you'd ever get in that 0.001%. But I guess I'm happy if the drugs are going to kill me. I mean, but the contaminants are not going to kill me. The drug may kill me. And then industrial enzymes, I was interested in Gui's talk because if you're going to treat wood chips with cellulases, it doesn't have to be very pure. It just has to have the properties that you want. When we were isolating phytase from alfalfa juice, we didn't do any fractionation at all. We just put the dried, and the enzyme was there, which broke down the phytic acid to phosphate, and that was all it took. So in certain cases, it doesn't have to be pure, but for safety and reproducibility reasons, you do purification, but it doesn't have to be 100% pure. Oop. So just to get oriented about fractionation, let me just go through an example. So let's say you start off with 100 grams of wet weight E. coli. This would be something like 40 liters of a good shake flask, or smaller volume of a small fermenter. About 12% of the total protein, wet cell mass is protein. So there would be about 120, there'd be 12 grams of protein. And let's just say there's an enzyme in there. So we start off with 100% of the enzyme activity and 100% of the protein. We'll just call that ratio 1. Okay, it started off at, and okay, then we do an ammonium sulfate precipitation, which is a very common thing to do in biochemistry, laboratory biochemistry. I probably never used in scale up anymore. But you add ammonium sulfate to an extract, you let it sit, you spin out whatever precipitates, then you add some more solid ammonium sulfate, you let it sit, you spin it out. And so you go, here's what precipitated out between 0 and 30% saturation, and between 30 and 35, 40. You make a series of what are called ammonium sulfate cuts. And then you do protein assays using the BSA standard. And then you do an enzyme assay. And it turns out in this 45 to 50% cut, you have 75% of the enzyme activity and only 15% of the total protein. So you've gotten rid of, and now the purity factor is 5. So you did a 5-fold purification. Now you put this on an ion exchange column, and let's say it's like a Q-Cephalose column or something like that, an anion exchange column. The basic and neutral proteins will flow through, you wash, and then you do a solid gradient elution. The things that are bound weakly to the column will come off earlier, the things that are bound very tightly will come out later. And at some point you'll find that your enzyme activity is here. So you pool this, and now you've got 60% of the original protein enzyme and only 2% of the original protein. So you've got a factor of 30, so you did another 6-fold purification. And then you finally do a gel filtration column, which separates on the basis. This separates on the basis of charge. This separates on the basis of size. And so when you do that, you get something. The very big things come off early, and the very small things come out with column volume, and your protein is here. So this now has got 0.3% of the total protein and 45% of the enzyme. It's got a purity factor of 150. So out of 100 grams of cells and 12 grams of protein, you end up with 36 milligrams of your product. This is a pretty typical kind of a thing for sort of laboratory biochemistry. If you can do something like this, you're doing okay. However, if you want to publish in my journal, you have to have something like this, which says, okay, there are 4 major steps. Here's how much total protein, how much total activity, some kind of relative specific activity, and overall yield. And okay, after the ammonium sulfate, I got rid of a lot of protein. I got rid of quite a bit more on doing the ion exchange, and I got rid of more doing the gel filtration. And so this step, I had a 75% yield. This step, I had an 80% yield. 80% of 75 is 60. And this step, I had a 75% yield. Now I'm down to 45. So my overall yield is 45. You can't believe, I wrote a paper or I think the Methods in Enzymology book on how to prepare a protein purification summary table. So if you want to know everything about this, but this is in it. You need something. Why do you need this? Well, if this number comes out to be 0.2%, who wants to follow a procedure that gives you a 0.2% yield? I mean, you want to be able to evaluate. Sometimes you see a thing like this, and everything is great except for one step. They lost 99% of the activity. Well, there's something wrong. Why they shouldn't even be publishing this paper because it's such a bad purification. You should only publish a paper on purification when you've done it numerous times and have improved it and shown that it's robust and works. I got a letter from somebody. This is before emails. And they said, Dr. Burgess, I have to tell you that I followed the procedure that you published about how to purify iron polymerase. It worked the first time. That was a huge compliment because that's what you want. You don't want something that doesn't ever work because you didn't tell them all the important details and where you can go wrong. So anyway, think about the person who might want to reproduce your work and make sure that you give enough details so that they can. Okay, so I won't spend time on this, but that's an amino acid. It's an amino group and a carboxyl group, an alpha carbon with a side chain. Two of them come together to form a peptide bond, release water, and so on. And you get to polypeptide with side chains, lysines and alanines and phenylalanines and serines and aspartic acid, and hydrogen is glycine and valine and so on. There are 20 different side chains. And here they are. And if you're going to work with proteins, you should learn the one-letter code. You should know that A is alanine and P is proline. Now the hard ones are something like W. And I don't know if you guys know about Daffy Duck, but I call it tryptophan. That's how I remember the W is tryptophan. And Q is glutamine. Not obvious, right? But think of cutamine. Anyway, it's called a mnemonic device. It's a way of remembering things, but you should know the one-letter code because you'll see it. Pia showed peptides from the mass spec, KHL. Okay, enough of that. But I want to point out that some of these have carboxyl groups, some of them have amino groups. Some of them are hydrophobic. They don't have any polarity. They hate water, hydrophobic, and they like to bury themselves away from this in the middle of a protein often. Some are polar and like to be on the surface next to water. So the properties of your protein are going to be determined by the amino acids and their sequence. And and what they're trying to do is to fold up in a way that buries most of the hydrophobic residues, puts most of the charged residues on the surface, not exclusively, but most of them, and does something. What it's supposed to do, I guess. Okay, so what are the main kinds of interactions? This is very elementary, I apologize, but hydrogen bonds, where a proton is shared, like this. And this is something that, the Watson-Crick base pairing of DNA, the reason that DNA melts is that hydrogen bonds get weaker at higher temperature. And so these I'm sorry. This is weakened by hydrogen, or by high temperature and strengthened by low temperature. But it's very dependent on distance and angle. So it doesn't happen all the time. The hydrophobic interactions is where you have some of these water hating residues like isoleucine and leucine and valine and on the surface. They still can be there. And if you have two proteins that have hydrophobic patches, then at high salt and high temperature, they tend to want to stick together and avoid water. But if you go to low salt, then they come apart. So there's a kind of a chromatography called hydrophobic interaction chromatography, where you have a bead that is hydrophobic, and your proteins will bind to the bead at high salt, and then you elute by decreasing the salt to weaken those interactions. And the more hydrophobic it is, the lower salt it requires in order to elute. So this is a property of a protein that you can use, and it's quite a good procedure, or quite a good method, actually. And the final thing is ionic interactions. You have a positive protein, let's say, and a negatively charged bead. They bind by ionic interactions. If you increase the salt, the counterion chloride associates with this positive charge on the protein, and the sodium is a counterion for this negative charge on the bead, and you elute. So with ion exchange, as you increase the salt, you decrease the strength of ionic interactions. Now, just in case there's some engineers, some other kinds of people here, chemical engineers, ionic interactions were originally thought of in a vacuum. And Coulomb's law says that the energy of attraction here is based on the charge, and the square divided by the square of the distance between the charges. But in real life, in biochemistry, you have to put a term here, and it's called the dielectric constant. And for water, it's 80. So it means that the attraction of a positive and negative charge is 80 times weaker in water than it is in a vacuum. If you do it in hexane, which is very nonpolar, it's 2. So what happens is that water isn't like this, it's more like this. It has a partial negative charge on the oxygen, and it has partial positive charges. It aligns, and this part can interact with a positively charged group on the protein. This part can interact with a negatively charged group on the bead. And so it's like a little bit of salt. And the more polar your solvent is, the weaker the ionic interaction. Because people couldn't understand what dielectric constant was, so I added that one. Okay, but anyway, the variables here are that you can vary temperature. High temperature, you weaken hydrophobic hydrogen bonds, but you strengthen hydrophobic interactions. Ionic strength, ion type, polarity, pH. If you change the pH, of course, the charge on your protein is going to change, and so it may or may not bind to a certain ion exchange resin. Even pressure. It turns out that some of the interactions are, when it comes together, it has a slightly smaller volume than when they're two separate, and so if you put it under high pressure, Le Chatelier's principle says that high pressure will cause it to come together because it has a smaller total volume. Okay, so what are some of the handles? What properties of proteins can you use? Well, these are obvious. Size. So proteins, most proteins are in the range of 100 to 1,000 amino acids, which is about 11 to 110 kilodaltons. But there are really small proteins, and there are some giant proteins. I think the protein Titan that's in muscle is a very big protein. It's 1.6 million daltons. And of course, a protein that's 11 kilodaltons might actually exist as a tetramer or a hexamer. So it's going to be actually 66 on 11 kilodaltons. Shape, this is really important. It's an important source of artifacts. If you have a protein that's spherical, it's called a globular protein. If it's sort of cigar-shaped, it's asymmetric. Now, what happens if you try to determine the size of this? Let's say these proteins are the same density and the same volume. They're the same molecular weight, in fact. If you try to sediment these down through a sucrose gradient, what happens? Well, it turns out the sphere sediments faster than the cigar, because the cigar, as it moves through the solution, there's more friction. So it appears that the cigar is smaller because it sediments slower. That's an artifact. If you run gel filtration or size exclusion chromatography, it's exactly the opposite. Size exclusion, you have beads, and you have pores in the beads, and proteins, as they move down the column, can go into the pores and out of the pores and into the pores, and how much time if they spend no time in the pore, then they go right through the column and come out in what's called the void volume, about 30%, in the volume that's outside of the beads. If they are very small, they can go in, and if they spend as much time in the beads as out of the beads, they see the whole volume of the column, and they come out in what's called the column volume. If you have two proteins, a sphere can go in and out with a certain partition coefficient. And so it turns out that the ability to go into pores is based on the Stokes radius. Now the problem is that most molecular weight markers that you use in sizing columns are globular. And so if your protein happens to be a cigar, cigar shaped, it's going to come out, look bigger because it doesn't go into, spend as much time in the pores, and so it's going to come through faster through the column, and it can be as much as, look as if it were a dimer. I've seen many people run it and run a protein sample and say, look, it's a dimer, and I say, well, is your protein globular or is it a cigar? So I'm just pointing out that even though sedimentation and gel filtration are widely used, you have to know a little bit about them. And molecular weight markers almost always are globular proteins. So if your protein is not globular, you're going to misjudge the molecular weight. This turns out to be the key. I was an expert witness in a patent trial a number of years ago, about 25 years ago, between Roche and Promega. And it had to do with Taq RNA polymerase, DNA polymerase. It turns out that the whole thing hinged on what was the size of the recombinant Taq polymerase that Cetus had discovered compared to the size of the paper that had been published 12 years earlier that purified this protein from this same organism, the DNA polymerase. Turns out they were the same, and the patent basically was invalid. But the answer was that one group used one method to purify it, to measure the molecular weight, and the other group used a different one. And they never bothered, the more recent one didn't bother to use the methods that were in the original paper. In fact, I think they refused to actually do that. And as a result, they claimed that theirs was different. And they got the patent. And later on, it didn't hold up. So I tell students that something as mundane as this can actually have big consequences. Okay, charge. The charge is determined by not all the amino acids, but some. The ones that have carboxyl groups or amino groups or imidazole groups. And each one of those groups has a pKa, a pH at which half of the proton has been dissociated. And so if you look at one of them, like aspartic acid, at very low pH it has no charge because the carboxyl group has a proton on it. But at the pKa of around 4.5, proton comes off, and from then on it's negatively charged. With something like lysine, it's got an amino group which is positively charged until you get clear out to 10.4. Around there it starts to come off, and then after that it's uncharged. So at pH 2 everything is every amino acid is either uncharged or positive, and at pH 12 everything is pretty much, well, a little past 12, negative or uncharged. And so you can actually plot this up, and here's a plot, and the place where this is the total positive charge, this is the total negative charge. This is the isoelectric point. This is the place where the number of positive and the number of negative is the same. It doesn't say the protein is uncharged. It just says that the net charge is 0. In fact, this is a protein which binds to both anion and cation exchanges. And that's because, whereas most proteins have their charges distributed sort of uniformly around the surface, sigma 32 has all the positive charges on one side and all the negative charges on the other. So if this side likes to bind to a cation exchange column, this side likes to bind to an anion exchange column. So it's not every protein that does this, but it's a possibility. Okay, hydrophobicity I've already talked about. If you have a hydrophobic patch, you can bind it to a hydrophobic resin and at high salt where it strengthens, and then you can elute with a decreasing salt gradient. Solubility, serum albumin, I think, may have a solubility of something like 300 milligrams per mil. I mean, it's the most soluble thing I've ever seen. Some proteins, on the other hand, are insoluble if they get above about a microgram. So it has to do with a lot of properties, but in general, things are the least soluble at their isoelectric point. If you're at your isoelectric point, your net charge is 0, so you can approach each other, and then if you have any interaction, it happens. If you go to more acid or more base, the protein gets charged, and you get charge repulsion, and so it's less likely to come into contact. It's less likely to aggregate and to precipitate. Finally, I mean, there's also ligand binding. If your protein binds ATP or ADP or cyclic TMP or FAD or whatever, you can actually attach that chemical to a bead and use affinity chromatography to purify out the protein in some cases. My RNA polymerase was an interesting example of a protein that was a monomer at 0.3 molar salt, but a dimer at 0.05. So you never use the same step twice in purification unless you change something. In this case, I would size it at high salt. It's something that was about $500,000. It's a big complex of proteins. Then I would size it at low salt, it would get $1 million and all the things that were 500,000 got left behind. So I was able to do a pretty good purification just by doing a high salt, low salt sizing. And this is something that you only learn if you play with your protein a while. Then there's post-translational modifications, which I'm not going to go into much, but there are now many, many things that are being found attached to proteins: carbohydrates, phosphates, lipids, sulfates, methyl groups, acetyl groups, and so on. These can be handles. There's proteins called lectins in plants and other organisms that bind to certain carbohydrate, and so if your protein has a maltose-rich carbohydrate sticking on the surface, it will bind to a certain plant lectin, maybe wheat germ or gluten or something like that. So those are handles. You can use anything you can when you're trying to purify something. And then, of course, there's things like epitopes. If I have a monoclonal antibody against a protein, it binds to a specific set of amino acids in a certain geometry. If that's on the surface of my protein, I can purify that protein away from essentially everything else. It's very powerful. Yeah, I'm not going to go through these. Again, I don't know whether actually my slides can be put onto one of the organizing unit websites so that people could just go to the website.
Yes, we're going to do that.
Okay, good. So, I mean, part of this is here just for if you want to study it in the future. I don't have time to go through it. Okay, so to summarize this, there you can separate things by precipitation, and I'll talk a little bit more about this based on solubility or charge or size or isoelectric point. Various kinds of chromatography, size, ion exchanges, charge distribution, hydrophobic interaction, surface hydrophobic patches, DNA affinity. If you have a protein that binds to a specific DNA sequence, you can actually make a column that is enriched for that sequence, and you can use it to pull out that DNA binding protein. you have a his tag, which many people use. It binds to chelated nickel. So a tag-specific affinity is very common. Immunoaffinity is what I'm going to give my talk tomorrow on. And there you're looking at a very specific epitope. There's also another thing called chromatofocusing, which is not used very much, even though it's quite an effective method, because it's hard to understand. People are shy away from things they can't easily understand. Electrophoresis, you can now isolate enough material out of a gel to do important mass spec work, and one of my most cited papers was how to cut bands out of gels and renature the enzyme and get enzyme activity out of a SDS band. And it worked really well. So, but you don't get very much stuff, but then again, you don't need very much stuff in some cases. You can also separate by salt centrifugation or ultrafiltration, which again has to do with size and shape. Okay, so let's go on here. This is important. People say, well, why do we need protein purifiers? I mean, we have the sequences of all the proteins. We literally do. I mean, I don't know of anybody who's working on a protein where the sequence of the whole genome is. Is anybody? I mean, it's so easy to get a genome sequence these days that if you're interested, you can get it done. So what can you learn from the amino acid? So it used to be we didn't know anything, and then we would do amino acid composition, and then we knew that it had a lot of acidic, aspartic and glutamic acid. We knew it was probably acidic, but we didn't know really anything. Even when we got the sequence, we still didn't know anything. You can determine the molecular weight of the polypeptide if you know the sequence. You can do one of those plots that I showed you where of pH versus charge, and you can determine estimate the isoelectric point. You can measure, you can determine how much it's going to absorb at 280 nanometer UV light, because all of the absorption at 280 is due to tryptophan and tyrosine, and if you know how many tryptophans and tyrosines, you can estimate. I think that's actually a very good way to determine protein concentrations. You can say that it's got a lot of hydrophobic residues, or that it has a stretch of 20, which probably means that it's this membrane spanning domain. You can look for conserved motifs that suggest it's a cofactor, and there's a typical thing that is associated with NAD binding, cofactor binding. You might say, aha, this looks like an NAD binding site, and so that gives you some clue. And of course, if you now take your protein and you compare it to other sequences, and you see this is clearly a trypsin-like protein, then you can actually, and if the trypsin-like protein has been purified, you have some clues about how this one might purify. But what don't you know? Well, you don't know the three-dimensional structure or shape unless a family member has been, structure has been determined. You don't know whether it's a monomer or a dimer or a tetramer or a hexamer or associated with 19 other proteins. And I'll tell you, there are complexes now that have 45 different polypeptides, often in single transduction or transcription factors in eukaryotes. Unbelievable, large, complex groups of proteins. So you have no idea what size your protein is going to be a priori. You really can't predict what ammonium sulfate concentration will cause it to precipitate. And you can't predict hydrophobic patches or charge distribution or antigenic sites. So my conclusion is that there's still place for people who know how to purify proteins, and it's very empirical. You just have to try it. Does it bind to and where does it elute from an ion exchange? What size does it run on a gel filtration? We have many more ways of fractionating proteins than we need. I mean, usually just a few things like sizing and ion exchange will give you a lot, especially if you start off with something that's 10% pure, like if it's overproduced. Okay, just a few words about protein inactivation. It doesn't do you any good to purify a protein and get it out and you've got 5 milligrams of pure protein and it's completely inactive. So one of the challenges is to try to keep mean, we're talking here about enzymes, but anything that has a function to keep its functionality during the purification. Now, obviously, if protein, an enzyme is made up of two subunits, alpha and a beta, and you purify alpha away from beta, it's going to be pure, but it's not going to be active because you've lost one of the components of the enzyme. So, I mean, there are, but generally speaking, you want it to be, we don't want to damage it. So, oxidation and foaming can be a problem. You can store proteins under argon, no oxygen, no oxidation. Or you can add a reducing agent. You get degradation on storage, well, due to protease. Well, you can add a protease inhibitor, you can keep it colder, you can purify it away from the protease sooner, and therefore there's less protease around it. But you know, this was a real problem with yeast enzymes. Yeast is full of proteases. In the early days, when we purified, the first time that SDS tills were really being used much, in my experience, people started to determine molecular weights of commercial yeast enzymes. They published 3 or 4 papers. All of them were wrong. And it's because there were proteases in the sample. You put your sample into SDS sample buffer with SDS, and what happens is the proteases tend to be more stable, and most of your proteins open up, and then the proteases chew them up into smaller pieces, and so a picogram of protease in a sample that's being put into sample buffer will cause degradation unless you heat it immediately after you put it into the SDS. So you've got to put it in and heat it immediately to inactivate the protease. Otherwise, the protease. Do the experiment. Put 2 samples into SDS sample buffer, heat one immediately, and hold the other one for 3 hours on the lab bench on a gel. You'll be amazed. So don't ever let things sit around in sample buffer with it. Absorption is a big issue if you're working with very dilute concentrations of protein. I see people make up dilution series of BSA to use as protein standards, going way down to the very low levels. Those tubes don't have that concentration. A tube will, most surfaces will absorb a microgram of protein per square centimeter. It means an Eppendorf tube will absorb about 4 micrograms. You put a mill of 1 microgram per mil in there, all of your protein will be absorbed to the wall of the tube the next day. So don't store things at very low concentrations unless you take some precautions. One precaution is polypropylene tubes are better than most things. Don't use polystyrene. It's designed to bind protein. You can have a carrier like BSA that is meant to absorb to the surface and protect your protein. I found that glycerol helps to minimize absorption. The most important thing I found is and I'll mention this slide, is a low level of a non-ionic detergent like 0.001% Triton or NP40. Absorption that was chromatic can be completely abolished by that. What you're basically doing is you're covering up the sticky surface of the tube with something else so it spares it. Aggregation often comes by storing it too concentrated. Heavy metals, I one time talked to a guy who was trying to purify polymerase using, he said it always died, and I said, well, what are you using as reagents? He says, I'm using glycerol, but there's a 55-gallon drum of it out in our loading dock. And I said, well, gee, there might be a little iron in that. Why don't you try going from 0.1 to 5 millimolar EDTA? Everything, all his problems went away. The problem was there was too much iron in his glycerol, and it was killing him. Things sitting around can have things grow in them. Generally, bacteria don't like tris or EDTA or azide. They love phosphate and acid. So don't leave things sitting around in a phosphate buffer. You'll get bacteria growing, they produce proteases, they degrade your. The rest of these are, oh, if you have a buffer, if you work in a little tissue culture lab where there's a CO2 incubators, the level of carbon dioxide in the air is much higher. Means all your buffers pH drops. Because carbon dioxide dissolves in water, produces an acid, carbonic acid. And you can see a 2 pH drop sometimes if you store solutions without being tightly sealed in a room that has high levels. So be careful. Okay. I'm not going to talk much about this except to say that different proteases can be inhibited by different things. You know, for example, EDTA inhibits metalloproteases. PMSF, which I remember as evening in San Francisco, phenyl sulfonyl fluoride, which is sort of a version of nerve gas, reacts with serine proteases. The reason the nerve gases work is they bind to and inactivate acetylcholinesterase, which is an esterase, which is an active site serine. And so, anyway, you can use PMSF sitting around. I don't know if Pia, you've had this situation where if you use PMSF, it can actually interact with proteins with active site serines.
We've never seen it, but we've never checked it either, so I don't know.
It's a pretty big chunk of stuff here, but anyway, if you do this, you want to not let it sit around in a lot of PMSF. You want to get on with the thing. There's another one which you can add to that. And there's another thing like this that is more expensive, of course, but you can then add something to quench it so that it doesn't react with your protein. And then finally, there are various protease inhibitor kits. Most of them suggest you use it at an unreasonably high level so that they can sell you a lot. But you can use it at least 5 times more dilute than they say, and it still works as well. Okay. Oxidation, I again won't go into much, except to say that it happens. Beta-mercaptoethanol was the standby. 14 millimolar was standard. It smelled like terrible. First time I ever worked in the cold room all night, I was wearing my winter parka. I spilled 5 mils of beta-mercaptoethanol on my parka. And boy, my roommate was not happy when I came home. DTT was developed in Wisconsin by Mo Cleland. It's basically a dimer of mercaptoethanol. It's not volatile, so it doesn't smell. And it oxidizes more easily, so it's a better oxidizing agent, reducing agent. So this is what we use in our buffers. There are some new ones, ECEP, don't have thiol. One thing you need to remember, if you make a solution of beta-mercaptoethanol as a reducing agent and let it sit around in the cold room for a month, it will air oxidize, and now you will have a buffer with oxidizing. Exactly the opposite of what you wanted. There are ways to test whether your sulfhydryl concentration is what you expect. The protein absorption, I've already mentioned some. It's a severe problem. Here's the experiment. We were doing, remember I was talking to you about GFP, looking at fluorescence, refolding. Well, we had that experiment where we put native GFP in, and so just as a control for how much fluorescence we would expect if it completely something refolded. And we used a different kind of plates, these black fluorescent plate reader plates. And this was the signal of the native stuff. In 15 minutes, 10 minutes, we'd lost not half the signal. So almost surely what happened is that here's a cylinder in the microflator dish. The protein was put in, it was at a microgram per mil. The protein bound to the surface, and with the light that excites the fluorophore comes down the middle of the well and comes back up the middle of the well. So anything that binds to the walls, you don't see. What binds to the bottom, you do see, and that's why this doesn't go all the way down. And so what we did was to just play around with how much the Igapol is like NP40, it's a non-ionic detergent. And we went down to 0.002%. And all of this is what happens if you don't have any non-ionic detergent. These are duplicates. And these are what happen if you even have just a trace of non-ionic. So it completely prevented this absorption. I think this is really a good lesson. Now, another kind of plate from a different vendor had been coated, and it didn't have any absorption problems. So there are plates that can be treated in a way that don't absorb. But don't assume that your system is not going to absorb a couple micrograms per square centimeter, and that you might lose everything if you have a very dilute solution. Okay, protein stability measurements. This is a melting curve of collagen. As you increase the amount of calcium chloride, you see that the melting temperature goes from 30 down to 10. So you're destabilizing the protein. If you plot that melting temperature as a function of increasing salt concentration for a bunch of different salts, you find that there's quite a few salts that destabilize proteins, and they're called chaotropic. And it turns out there are some that stabilize, like potassium phosphate, ammonium sulfate, and I think potassium glutamate. Sodium chloride and potassium chloride pretty much have no effect. We're talking about going out to 2 or 3 molar here. So these are called chaotropes. These are called cosmotropes, and I think these names come from this induces chaos. You know, it unfolds your proteins, and this one induces order, as in the order of the cosmos, right? I don't know. That's the way I think. Anyway, this is an important thing, and so things like guanidine hydrochloride and lithium thiocyanate, you know, are quite denaturing. Things like ammonium sulfate are quite stabilizing. That's why ammonium sulfate has been such a popular. Now, I taught in a course in Hamburg, Germany, an MBA course 7 years ago, and there was a guy named Boivin, which is a great name. Means drink wine, I guess. But he gave a lecture in this course about using something called thermoflor. And in this is a very nice method for measuring temperature, the transition temperature. You have a protein, and you have a molecule in here, and it can be a variety of things. Cypro orange works really well. You mix them together. This isn't fluorescent in solution, but as you increase the temperature and it starts to unfold, it exposes hydrophobic regions. The hydrophobic regions bind the dye becomes fluorescent. And so you can see here that if you stick this into a PCR machine, that you can program to slowly increase the temperature, and you just measure the fluorescence, you can see up it goes. So the inflection point is defined as the TM, place where it's half the way to this is native and this is denatured, because this is the highest signal. Now you can add things. You can do glycerol, whatever you want, and you can, if you find something, you might find something that will increase the melting temperature 5 degrees. That means that if you're trying to do crystallography, you have a better chance of getting a crystal, because proteins bound to ligands tend to be more homogeneous and more likely to form crystals. If you are trying to find something to stabilize a protein, and add up, they call these things during the formulation. Anyway, this is a quick way to determine and you can do this. It takes 20 microliters of a 0.1 milligram per ml solution, 2 micrograms to get a curve like that. So you can easily do 20 different additives and see which one, if any, stabilizes or destabilizes your protein to melting. So I talked about heavy metals already. Things like iron and lead and things like that often bind to proteins and activate. And what we usually do is to have a chelator. I told you about the metal from. Chelator is like EDTA. And the question I have often had when I first started was, how if I add 0.1 millimolar EDTA to a buffer that has 10 millimolar magnesium, does it do my protecting my proteins? The answer is, from my sophomore chemistry, analytical chemistry book, I was a chemistry major at Caltech, is that heavy metals bind about 10 to the 10th times tighter than magnesium to EDTA. So even if you have your EDTA saturated with magnesium, if a heavy metal comes along, it's going to bind and never come off. And so you still can protect your protein against heavy metals, even in the presence of an excess of magnesium. But this is EDTA has got its tetraacetic acid. It has four carboxyl groups on the ethylene diamine, and it really just binds metal right in there. It's used in analytical chemistry, and of course it's related to immobilized metal affinity chromatography. The big problem is aggregation. Protein that if you're trying to do NMR, it requires having 5 or 10 milligrams per mil. And often proteins are not used to being that concentrated and they aggregate. Crystallography, if you have heterodispersity, some monomers and some dimers and some tetramers, form crystals very easily. So, and in protein therapeutics, it's a huge problem. Monoclonal antibody aggregation is one of the biggest problems in therapeutic monoclonal antibodies. So it's a big problem to test and to prevent it. And usually they find mutants that don't aggregate, that are less likely to aggregate. Sometimes people add a low level of a denaturant, like half molar urea, which is enough to denature it, but will prevent it from aggregating in when they do NMR, for example. Even salt, I've had many proteins that at 5 milligrams per mil precipitate out. If you bring the salt up to half molar, they would go right back into solution. You dilute them a little bit, come right back out of solution. Buffers, I think most people know about buffers. I'm not going to cover that, except that just know that tris changes its pH with temperature quite a bit. Phosphate changes its pH with salt. So if you take a 1 molar phosphate buffer and you titrate it to pH 6, 8, and then you dilute it down to 10 millimolar, it's now going to be like 7.4. Because the salt is much lower. It's easier to take a proton off of a phosphate in the presence of salt than it is in the absence of salt. You have 2 negative charges and 1 positive. You have to pull 1 away from 2. It's hard. At higher salt, it's easier. And therefore, if you have a phosphocellulose column, which is 1 molar phosphate on the column, and you equilibrate it at very low pH, or very low salt, and then you do a salt gradient. At some point, the pH, as salt gets higher, a lot of protons get released, and the pH can change 2 units. And these are things you learn by making lots of mistakes over the years. This is, I think I may stop here. My time is probably. Anyway, this is what I call my happy buffer, happy protein buffer. I mean, it has everything you need. It's got a buffer, which helps control the pH. It's got a stabilizer like glycerol. It's got a chelator like EDTA. It's got a reducing agent to help prevent oxidation. It's got a little bit of salt to keep things from binding to ionic groups on surfaces and stuff. Storage buffer, I almost always just cause this to be 50% glycerol. You can take a sample in 50% glycerol and it won't freeze at minus 20. So you can store it at minus 20, but you can go in and take a sample without freezing and thawing. Or you can store it at minus 80 and it will thaw without any loss of activity. I've had people say, I can't freeze and thaw it, and my stuff always dies. And I say, store it in 50% glycerol. They wrote me back. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. I can now freeze and thaw 10 times and I never lose any activity. I used to, at one point, when somebody asked me for some RNA polymerase, I would take a polypropylene tubing, I would suck up 50 microliters, I would melt both ends, and I would stick it in an airmail envelope and mail it, no dry ice, to Europe. I don't know if I could do that anymore. but the fact of the matter is, it's completely stable at room temperature. It's very stable, and it's because glycerol tightens up the structure. It makes it less susceptible to proteases. It makes it less likely to expose hydrophobic internal regions that are sticky, and stick to surfaces, and to aggregate. So for the first approximation, I was sending RNA polymerase, which is a 500,000 Dalton 6 subunit protein machine, and it still was perfectly fine. I think maybe I can stop here. Is that all right? There's a couple of slides here about precipitation, but precipitation is it's useful, but it's not certainly not generally done on an industrial scale. Just because the need to centrifuge and use a lot of ammonium sulfate. You often end up using 2 or 3 molar ammonium sulfate. I mean, it's good. You can use the supernatant as for fertilizer for your lawn. Turns out it's a very good fertilizer. Okay, I think I'm going to stop.